State management refers to the management of various states that an application can have at any given time. State within an application can keep track of a variety of different things, from a checkbox being selected or deselected, from a certain amount of text being within a text field, or if your application is in an error or non-error state. And you can imagine as your application grows in size and complexity, so does its state. So to address applications' growing pains from increasingly complex state, there's been a number of state management solutions that have been introduced in the past couple of years. What's up, I'm Gemma, and in this video, and probably in a number of future videos, we're going to be taking a closer look at the variety of state management solutions for front-end web development. For each solution, we're going to be taking a closer look at their pros and cons, so you know which solution is best fit for your application. We'll be looking at these solutions through the lens of React, but a lot of the pros and cons and principles that are introduced in these videos can be applied to other popular front-end framework options. So for this video, which was recommended by Colin Danella, we're going to be taking a closer look at React's prop drilling. So we have to answer the obvious question of what is prop drilling? Prop drilling is the process where a developer passes their props down a deeply nested React component tree in order for its children components to have access to that top level object. It's also referred to as threading, since you can think of the process of passing these props down the component tree like a string going through some cloth, where the string is the data that's getting passed down and the cloth or the multiple pieces of cloth can be the components. To put this analogy into a more technical context, let's imagine that we have an application and at the top level we create a user object with some important data that we want to pass down the component tree so its children components can have access to the user. If I wanted to take advantage of prop drilling, I would pass the user object into my app component and then pass the user prop into my dashboard component, which will allow me to pass it into my home component, and this process can keep going as long as I want it to. So by the time we reach the bottom of our React tree, we can see that our innermost components, create post and settings, have referential access to the top level user object, since it's been passed down through all of those components. So now that we understand what prop drilling is, we have to ask the question of why we would even want to use prop drilling. One of the major, or probably the only major benefit of prop drilling is that it's super straightforward and pretty simplistic. When you take advantage of prop drilling, you create a direct line of props that connect from one component to the next component. So this makes it very clear to developers where a prop is coming from and where a prop is going to. If you have a small application with not that many components or not a ton of state to manage, prop drilling might be a viable option since it's pretty easy to maintain for smaller applications and it's very simplistic, explicit, and straightforward. I say this because you can still achieve the same functionality that you expect from a small scale application that manages a little bit of state with prop drilling without having to introduce any fancy APIs or third-party packages. We can take a look back at our last code block to understand what it means for it to be explicit. When you take advantage of prop drilling, you clearly define which props are going to get passed in from one component and passed into another component. So we can see here with our app, dashboard, home, settings, and create post components, we're able to pass the user props down the React tree into each component. So if we were starting with our settings component, we can work back up the React tree to figure out where user came from. So again, this is a really big benefit for smaller scale applications that don't have a ton of components or state to manage, because you can easily track between the few files that you have in your app to figure out where props are coming from. Another benefit, which probably might not be as major as the first benefit, is that props are built into React. You can't have React without props, and you can't have props without React. So if React ever updates in the future, you can definitely rely on the idea that props still exist, so you don't have to update your state management approach if anything were to change with React. But let's say that a third-party package updates its internal code and it's a huge breaking change, then now you have to update your own application code to make sure that it's still connecting properly with that package. So one of the smaller benefits of props is that you don't have to worry about third-party packages updating and possibly breaking your application code. But again, this might be a smaller concern since a lot of popular third-party state management solutions like Redux usually adhere to the same API and structure even throughout its numerous updates. So now we have to ask the question of why we wouldn't want to use prop drilling. The interesting thing about prop drilling is that it's commonly labeled as an anti-pattern in React. If you perform a quick Google search, you'll probably be greeted with a number of Medium articles and blog posts talking about how prop drilling is an anti-pattern and how we should avoid it at all costs. So Although these articles make fair and solid points, which we'll cover in a minute, I think it's important to understand when we should be using prop drilling over other state management solutions. Yes, prop drilling does produce its fair amount of drawbacks when introduced or used in more complex and large applications, but to call it an outright anti-pattern might be a little unfair given that prop drilling definitely does have its benefits for smaller scale applications. Basically what I'm saying is that every state management solution has its fair share of pros and cons, but I think we have to look at those pros and cons in the appropriate context for which those solutions are intended for. So now that we covered that, let's take a look at the first major concern, which is exposing unnecessary state to components. One of the major concerns with prop drilling is that you can definitely run into a situation where you're exposing props or state information to components that don't necessarily need to know about that information. If the only purpose of a component taking in a prop is to then pass that prop into its child component, then you're exposing unnecessary state in that component. Doing this can clutter up a lot of your components since you're exposing data that has no place in those components. So again, if we take a look at our code block, we can see that the only components that really need to use the user object are our settings and create post components. So instead of calling our create user function all the way at the top inside of app, we could call that function inside of our home component and then pass our newly created user object into our settings and create post components. So now with this updated code block, we can see that only our home, settings, and create post components have access to our user object, which definitely cleans up the path of props that are getting passed from app into our home component. And now we can also see that our home component knows how to create or get our user object. The only drawback with this approach is now our home component is holding the logic responsible for creating our user object. And if we didn't want our home component to know about how the user object comes about, then this might not be the best approach. Another common concern with prop drilling is that it introduces a lot of tedious maintenance. If a large scale or more complex application was taking advantage of prop drilling, then you could easily find yourself with developers having to maintain so many props and so many different components, and if you had to update, rename, or delete some props, then that whole maintenance chain is going to be hectic. I did mention before that explicitness is a benefit of prop drilling, which is a pretty good thing because you can track where a prop is going or where it's coming from. But I think it starts to get a little out of hand when you have larger scale applications. For example, let's say that you change one of your props names in one of your higher level components. Now that you've made this change, you have to go through all of the children components that take that prop and make sure that the names align with the top level prop name change. And this can definitely become a very tedious task with the more components and state introduced in your application, which can just lead to bugs along the way of refactoring. So here you can see with this updated code block that I changed my user object to old user. And because I made the change of the prop name in my dashboard component to old user, I have to go through all dashboard's children components and change them from user to old user. And you can imagine how much more crazy things can get when you have components with a ton of props living on them, which are also getting passed over to a lot of children components that have a ton of props living on them as well. So that's the great thing about having various state management solutions available to you. A lot of these concerns are addressed with other solutions, which we'll take a look at in a future video. Although prop drilling gets exposed for its numerous limitations when it gets used in more large scale or complex applications, I do think there are a number of benefits that come from using prop drilling for smaller scale, simplistic applications. One of those benefits include it being very explicit. You know where a prop is coming from and you know where a prop is going. On top of that, prop drilling is a great no-package solution. You don't have to introduce any fancy APIs or third-party packages like Redux to be able to manage the state in your apps. And on top of that, you can always rely on props existing within React. Again, React cannot exist without props, and props cannot exist without React. My rule of thumb, avoid any premature refactoring. Sure, you could see your application becoming very large and very complex that requires maybe some API or third-party package, but if you aren't feeling the pain points of state management right now, maybe it's worth asking yourself if it's worth introducing a new package or a new service into your app to manage state. But that's it for prop drilling. Let me know if you have been using prop drilling in your applications or if you've been using a different state management solution. Or you can also let me know what your go-to state management solution is. I've got more videos on the way, so if you want to see more content, please drop a like for this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm also on Twitter where I talk about JavaScript. Please feel free to reach out to me, send me a DM, and we can have a chat. And with that, I'll see y'all in the next one.